So before we get this video started, this is the top 10 worst animes that I have seen. This is very much opinionated, and let me know if you agree with my list. What would you add? What would you remove? Let's just jump straight into it. Number 10 was Reincarnated as a Slime season 3. Now, of course, you may have liked this season. I personally didn't. There was just more epilogue than there was action. And of course, in the trailers, it was a big deceive because they showcased the action, and the action was like every 10 episodes of the show. It really starts to pick up steam like in the later half when they do the tournament or introducing the kingdom of Jura into the main world. But before that, it's all exposition, all talking, all more world building. And as much as I like that in the show, I want that to be doved into the action part of Reincarnated as a Slime. We really don't get to see the rematch between Rimuru and Hinata until the end of the show, and to many people's dropped it just because they were talking way too much. So a lot of the action you have to hold on for a 24 episode season to the end of the show. I just didn't like it, and it's number 10. I did finish the show. I just personally did not like it, so that's why it's on my number 10 spot. Let's move on to number 9. Number 9 is, of course, the healer who was banished from his party is in fact the strongest. This is just a regular generic anime, and mostly I really like the concept of, you know, someone who being banished, starting from the bottom and getting all the way up, gaining love and respect from new friends and family on their new adventure, basically restarting. I really like those stories, but this one was just generic as heck. There was nothing unique about this series. I stopped watching the show and I dropped the show around episode 8, episode 9, just because nothing gained my attention. There was nothing in that show that could gain anyone your attention. It was a show you could coast through, that you could have in the background just in case you wanted to have like a show in your background, but there's nothing unique in the show. You can basically predict what was going to happen every single episode in the future. That is why it's at my number 9 spot. I did end up dropping the series at episode 9, but this made my number 9 spot. Let's move on to number 8. Number 8 on the list would be Wedding Rings. Now, Wedding Rings is a regular isekai anime where the high schooler, of course, gets transported into another world and basically gains a harem to, in case, fight the major villain of this story. Now, unfortunately, I did watch 2 episodes of this show, and since it's all about him being with, you know, the abundance of the woman around him, I just immediately dropped it. Of course, this throws in your face the fan service of it all, the plot of it all, but it's mostly just fan service. Neither do you really get to see any action, and if it's action, it's the Tamamaki action from Fire Force. It's just all fan service. It's not a show for me. I did end up dropping it. If you do like the show, I am not here to drop hate, but it's in my number 8 spot for the worst shows that came out in 2024, because you can't tell me that you giving me a generic harem isekai anime with nothing special towards it. It's like, it's bordering. It may be ecchi for real. Anyway, let's move on to number 7. Number 7 is 100 Girlfriends That Really Like You, 'Cause I Want You. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry, I really love you. This is, of course, just a harem anime based off of his, I want to say, prayer to the love goddess that he makes at the altar, saying, I really just want a soulmate in my life. Remind you, he is in high school. He doesn't even try. And the goddess, at least in this world, gives him 100 soulmates. So in turn, you get to see him go through rocky adventures and meet all different types of the girls that fall in love with him. I mean, every single girl falls in love with him. So this really doesn't have a lot of story or plot towards it. None of the girls really gain your attention. Of course, you get the regular tsunderes, the ones you want to root for, and even the childhood best friend. But there's nothing unique about it that really points out. I know this was one of more hyped up animes. I did give it a shot. I watched the first 5 episodes. I ended up dropping it because again, like Wedding Rings, it borderlines on edgy, and I'm not finna sit around and watch all that for real. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. Number 6, I think. Number 6. Yeah. Number 6 is, of course, Tower of God Season 2, and this was much more of a bigger disappointment than it was a fail. I think the story and the workshop battle that we were presented with had good stories and had enough to get you hooked if you were into that. But with the subpar animation, and it starts off real strong when we are introduced to Ban or Viol in the beginning of the show. He is instantly throwing hands how we want to, so it does gain the attention and tries to hook you within the show. But within that, all the budget may have just went to the first episode, because after that, the fight scenes go downhill. There's characters that we are introduced to, not really much backstory, and they're rather throwing hands way too much or instinctively trying to kill each other. Now, I think this season of Tower of God, I think what I would have liked was cut around a little more of the webtoon content, so we don't get the reunion so much ahead of the second part of season 2 in the workshop battle. I personally did not like this season. I think it was a real big disappointment. Subpar animation, subpar with the storytelling, and just takes way too long for the story to really get started after we are introduced with Viol in like the first episode where he starts throwing hands. But that's just me. Let's move on to number 5. Number 5 is A Nobody's Way Up to an Exploration Hero is a lackluster fantasy with a poorly defined identity. Now, what we watching this show, now I did give this show a shot, is where he basically collects Pokemon cards of girls that help him in addition to become to his party to help adventure, gain money, and become this rich adventurer in his world. As of course he is just, as the Avengers are glorified in his world and are the most rich and make the most money in his world. Now, unfortunately, I don't know what happens past episode 5. I know he gains two Pokemon Girl training cards that use water, and of course they're both tsundere. So this sort of becomes sort of like a harem, even though they're Pokemon cards. I personally just did not like that, and it struggles to regain your attention because, of course, every episode is the same. Go in the dungeon, let them fight, and let him use bug repellent. Like, there's nothing special about these characters, at least in the earlier episodes, that gets you hooked. Now, much later on, I have no idea, but for me, it made my number 5. Let's move on to the next one. Number 4. Number 4 is, of course, Ninja Kamui, and like all the rest of the shows that will be mentioned, Ninja Kamui has a phenomenal start to the season. I mean, they're throwing hands, cutting off bodies, taking each and every one of the rogue ninjas out to the best of their ability, and they hook you much early on the show with the death of his wife and kid. So it's very much a lovable and very much an exciting anime. The first 4 episodes. Now, once they go to the more scientific side of introducing the machines to fight for them, using Iron Man beams to shoot high beams, to shoot energy blasts, and they go away from the title of the show that says ninja, is when it goes all the way downhill. For some reason, I wanted this more higher up, but I feel like it still can be at number 4 because it does have good moments in the show, especially early on. But they just lose it once they become 3D animation, and they just introduce the machines to fight for them instead of the hand-to-hand action that we have been shown in the beginning part of the anime. Once they lose that identity of the show, it went straight downhill. And might have been the biggest appointment of the year, besides Tower of God. Let's move on to number 3. Number 3 is Oshi no Ko Season 2. And unfortunately, like the first season that captured many hearts of the fans and many hooked onto that show and series itself, Season 2 tries to recapture the magic and the glamour of Season 1. But they can't do that, as of course it is all very much slow paced in I think the season had around 12-13 episodes. For me, I was a relatively new fan of Oshinoko, trying to rewatch the whole show, but season 2 had such a boring start. Such exposition was the most boring, with the exposition of explaining how the manga, TV series, and the background of how the show business is in Japan. So of course, it's tough, and plus we really don't get to the main plot points in the show of Aqua and his sister's, growth and development towards how they handle Ai's death. Of course, we see Aqua get more and more deeper into depression as he keeps trying to figure out how did Ai die and figure out his father's identity. But again, that becomes more of a subplot when that should be the main plot to Oshinoko. At least what got us interested into Oshinoko, at least what got me interested into Oshinoko in the first place. So that becomes more of a subplot, and I just really didn't like it. And the animation becomes subpar, and we really don't get to see any of the good, vibrant moments in season 2 like we see in season 1. So that's unfortunate, of course. Anyway, let's move on to number 2. Number 2 is Failure Framed and then climbs up to be the strongest. Again, I am a huge fan of someone who is at the bottom climbing up to be the top and eventually taking his revenge on the world and on his classmates. Afureta, Rising of the Shield Hero are pretty good examples of shows that do this and execute it pretty well. Even though Afureta did fall off this year with this season, that was disappointing. But with Failure Frame, it has such a good first episode with, of course, the generic introduction and isekai of it, with putting your hands, fighting the power, and basically him being the weakest, thrown to the side and discarded like trash. Fortunately, it does have a good first episode and does get you hooked. But then you get the show started, episode 2, episode 3, and then you see how they fight. It has a strange thing to switch from 2D animation to 3D animation. Now, this 3D animation they use in the fight scenes are whenever they have to do movement within the show. But the 2D animation they use is when they're talking or when there's a moment at night. To capture the real emotional moments, they use 2D, and I just really didn't understand it. Why don't they just keep it consistent? So it really does fall off the mark because that 3D animation that they use is a little stale, and the story itself really does not progress at all until like episode 10. So many people, or at least me, dropped the show before episode 10. Of course, if you are a fan of the show, I am not hating on it, but for me, it was my number 2 worst of 2024. Let's move on to number 1. My number 1 spot goes to Goodbye Dragon Life, and I personally just thought this show was as strange as it was. Of course, it is a very niche anime because it starts with, of course, the dragon basically being reincarnated after his death towards the hands of humans, trying to live a simple, quiet life with his family and in a small, remote village with his friends and family, of course. Now, the what makes this the worst anime, at least for me, is the weirdest concepts. For example, they have a woman in there that is a cow, and you know what they drink? They drink her milk. You know where her milk comes from? Her jugs. I'm not saying what her jugs is, but we know what her jugs is. They come from her jugs, and they're parading it around. They show it off to, at least in the anime, to a certain point where everyone's drinking her milk from her jugs. And I don't mean an actual jugular. I mean the jugs on her body, which is at least crazy to me. And of course, this is very much a generic anime. And of course, I really do like the peaceful life shows where he just encounters when he just wants to be left alone. Because I do relate to that the most. You just want to be left alone. You want to do what you want to do. And then not have these occurrences in your life. But of course, we get to see turns and turns against him, and I just didn't like this show entirely. It's generic. You really don't get anything out of it, and it's so friction. It's so stale within the animation and so stale within the storytelling that we really don't get to see a progression of really anything until the end of the show. Again, like and subscribe. This was my top 10 worst animes of this year. Let me know if you agree with me. Let me know your honorable mentions at the bottom, in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next one.